The funny thing is we are all establishing boundaries all the time. We just may not be establishing ones that are really effective. And if we feel uncomfortable, that means we're uncomfortable with the boundary that we have established. It's not working. So I think it's kind of interesting when people are like, oh, it just feels so awkward to set boundaries. And I'm like, well, you're feeling awkward with the boundary you've actually already set.
Life gets easier if we figure it out together. Welcome to The Lisa Show.
Are you good at setting boundaries? Do you know what a good boundary looks like? Well, I think you can feel when a boundary has been crossed, and that's a good place to start. I think that you feel overwhelmed or resentful or upset, or you just sort of feel off. So a few years ago, I had a friend who every interaction that we had, every conversation left me feeling really uncomfortable. I always felt like I shared too much. I was too revealing in my emotions, and I felt like it wasn't reciprocated. So I felt like I had just sort of bared my soul and it hadn't been returned. It was more of an interview than like a real conversation bringing us closer together. And I found myself avoiding this friend and being really critical of her and feeling really resentful. But I wasn't exactly sure why, because it hadn't been so clear, so cut and dry. So a few years ago, I realized that and I thought, this is my boundary. I will be vulnerable. I will be real and raw with someone if it is reciprocated, if we have that friendship. And I think I had been a little bit too casual with it. So moving forward, when I saw that friend, when we had conversations, I would be, of course, honest and forthright and have a good interaction, but never go really deep. Because for whatever reason, and honestly, the reasons don't really matter, it wasn't reciprocated. And so I felt like in keeping that boundary, I was being true to myself and still being honest and still being authentic. Do we have a different kind of friendship and relationship than I have with my other friends? Absolutely. Does that make it less valuable? No, it's just a different kind of relationship. So in establishing boundaries in that way, it ended up being a really great benefit to me because I was still able to maintain a relationship and protect myself at the same time. So boundaries can be used in different ways, but I was surprised by this experience that I hadn't realized it a little bit early. And we can have boundaries in all of our relationships, right? It's not just our friendships, but it's also with our family, with our partners, at work, or even society at large. We get to decide what our boundaries are, and we also get to learn what other people's boundaries are, what they feel safe and comfortable doing, and negotiating this is a part of living life, whether we acknowledge it or not. So what can we learn about boundaries from an extreme strain on a relationship? I'm here with Jessica Frew of the Husband-in-Law podcast. Jessica, what does your situation look like?
So I host a podcast with my husband, Matt, and my ex-husband, Steve. My ex-husband is gay and lives with his boyfriend. And my husband and I are active members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So it kind of creates an interesting dynamic there. And in our podcast, we share, from when Steve and I met each other, when Matt and his ex-wife met each other, until where we are now with co-parenting, divorce, marriage, coming out, religion, all of the things.
So many things.
We talk about all the things. We don't shy away from those. And my family, my immediate family, I very much consider Matt, my new husband, obviously, he's part of my family, but we have our nuclear family. I have a daughter that is 12 with my ex-husband, Steve. My husband, Matt, has 2 kids. So I have 2 stepkids who are 13 and 15. And then I very much consider my ex-husband still a part of my family. And now his boyfriend, who I just love and adore. And we do all of the things together. Like we do birthdays together and we hang out at our pool together and we have holidays together anytime that works. It's not assumed. It's very much still a those are those boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
It's still very much an invite and coming together, but it is, those are the people we want there. Whenever there's something going on, the first people that I invite are my family, but then Steve is always there. And I always say, Steve feels like my brother now, which is very weird because we share a child, but also it's not weird. It's like the most natural, normal thing to us at this point.
Well, and I'm sure, and this is true of many things, until you go through that experience, until you have it, you really don't know how you're going to actually feel about it. And your story is quite unique in the sense that it doesn't seem to me, just anecdotally, this is not based on my scientific research, my side hobby as a researcher, that's the hardest part to navigate in families when you're talking about what most people would see as two different families, a parent, a step parent, coming together and being able to have boundaries, having boundaries with your ex-husband and boundaries within your own marriage. Those are two different things. And it seems like you have good boundaries. How did you establish that? Or how did you get to this good place?
Lots of trial and error.
Really?
I always tell people, our boundaries have changed drastically. Steve and I have been divorced for 10 years now, which seems crazy. And Matt and I have been remarried for 8.5, so pretty quickly after that. But those boundaries have evolved because the more comfortable you get with somebody, you can kind of fill out new boundaries. But in the beginning, Steve and I very much were protective of each other's feelings and emotions. And that required different boundaries at that point.
Okay, so what did that look like?
So, respectful of the schedule, the custody agreement, of what we worked out. We don't just show up at each other's houses. We don't switch the schedule at the last minute. We encourage our daughter to go to the other person's house, even when sometimes it's a little hard or they just want to stay at their, in their bed or whatever, but supporting that relationship with the other parent. I think there's a lot of that trust and respect that needs to be put back in place after a divorce. And so there was that. Now we are much more flexible in that, but also there's a clear understanding that if we have an ask of, hey, can we change the schedule? In fact, I just got a text from Steve asking if we can change the schedule, that there's still that respect that if it doesn't get changed, it's okay. I can voice that and it will be respected and honored of, okay, I understand that. Thank you for considering it. There's a lot of appreciation given to. But those boundaries have evolved. And people think of boundaries as something that separates you from somebody else.
Sure.
That creates a divide. But really, boundaries bring people in because they help you know what is to be expected. It's a sign of love, respect, clarity, to have boundaries because then you know what is expected. And so that's really what they're for. I have boundaries with myself to show myself love of saying, hey, these are lines that you shouldn't cross and understanding that. So I think there's understanding that helps you put those boundaries in place and not feel like a jerk when you put those boundaries in place. It's really to bring that person in. And so they do evolve and they don't always evolve, but ours have very much evolved. And the boundaries changed again after I married Matt. Of course,
Yeah, what was that negotiation? Or I guess renegotiation? What was it like?
There were some definite fumbles in that. Like Steve and I were used to, we would go out to dinner occasionally to talk about, Penny, our daughter, and to figure out where we're at and to support each other. We genuinely still supported each other. And so those things changed. Like that wasn't respectful to my husband.
Oh, your new husband was like, hey, maybe you want to go to dinner with me.
Yeah. Or we invite him to come. Or Steve took me out to breakfast one day for our anniversary after I had been remarried. And Matt's like, hey, it's fine. And it really didn't bother me that much, but maybe not. Like maybe this is something to consider. And Steve instantly was like, I am so sorry. Like didn't think about this when I made the offer to Jessica. It definitely was not appropriate. And at this point, Matt probably would not care at all. But just that respect of the relationship and finding those dynamics. And it is so different for everyone. And I can say that because while Steve comes over for all of the things, we have a very different relationship with Matt's ex-wife where the boundaries look incredibly different and like pick up and drop off is done in the church parking lot, and we email through, that's the main form of communication and all of those things. So I understand that this can't look
I was going to say, sometimes when you hear a story like yours, you think, oh, must be nice because my ex doesn't, or, whatever it is. And knowing that it's just so tricky, sometimes when people, I think, hear boundaries, they think, well, it doesn't work in my case.
Yeah.
And so you're saying that you've seen it sort of on the other, and whatever your level of comfort is in sort of sharing, what is, establishing and renegotiating boundaries look like for someone who you don't have such a positive relationship with look like?
Yeah. People are always like, the first thing I think of is, they're like, would you have to tell them your new boundary, like this new thing that you realized you need? And I'm like, no. You do not have to. There are times when you might have to speak up for yourself or say, hey, I'm really not comfortable with this, but you don't have to say like, I put a boundary in place and I am no longer going to talk to you on the phone. And sometimes that's court ordered, but
right.
And stick to that.
Court ordered boundaries are a little bit easier to follow.
Even if it is court ordered, people will still try to push those boundaries, but still just, show up for yourself in that. If you know that things are going to be better for you, but also for your kids, if you stick to this boundary, give your kids that gift. It's not just a gift to yourself. It's also that the kids now know, okay, mom and dad are going to do pick up and drop off in the church parking lot. I'm going to walk from one car to the other. There's other people there. There's not going to be a fight when we get out of the car. There's not going to be an argument. There's not going to be whatever. They know that. And so they get to feel that peace and calm because they know what to expect. Instead of thinking, is there going to be a blow up? What's going to be brought up? Is somebody going to get thrown under the bus? Instead, they know what to expect. So it's giving your kids that gift too. And it definitely benefits you when you can put those in place.
Well, and it does seem like that it's easier to feel like you have a strong family. If everybody's on the same page, whether it's hard or whether it's easy, it just doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Just kind of having that knowledge is power.
Yeah.
kind of thing,
Yeah. And I went through a mourning process of recognizing that my relationship with Matt's ex-wife is not going to look the way I hoped it would. I really hoped we'd be able to have a similar relationship that Steve and I have. But it's not something that's going to happen, and that's okay. I had to let that go and also realize that we still have a great family dynamic when we're able to follow these boundaries, because we can be kind to each other and we can show support for each other and still encouraging the kids, this is your mom's time. We try to respect that. This is your dad's time. Hopefully that's respected as well. And they get to see that mutual respect.
And have you ever bumped up into an uncomfortable renegotiation of boundaries with kids? Because kids don't often have, if they feel like they don't have a choice in it, but they also don't have the life experience to recognize yet, how helpful that can be. And if they don't understand it, how do they react? How have you negotiated that?
So I feel like, again, in the beginning, they're little. Our kids were very little when we got married. And so we wanted to teach them that respect and trust. And so we very much stuck to schedules and timing and all of those things as much as we could. Now, as they've gotten older into teenage years, I think it's also important to show them that they can trust themselves, of saying, hey, I'm not feeling great about this situation at whoever's house. Could we maybe talk about switching some things? And so giving them that voice as well, I think, is hugely important so that they can start learning how to set their own boundaries, whether, the issue is with new partners or with step siblings or a step parent, being open to listening to that so that the kids can start learning how to set their own boundaries as well and learn how to trust themselves.
That's such a great advice, because I think that it seems so isolating, I think, as a parent, because every situation is so different, every dynamic. So different. And then you introduce more people into the family and into your kids' lives. I imagine that there is this want to sort of use boundaries as a way to control. And I'm wondering if you've ever experienced that and how you have used that to do what's in the best interest of your kids.
Yeah. So I think in the beginning, I got really hung up because there's so much out of my control as a step parent that I really got focused on maybe not boundaries with the other parent or the other house, but really things that happened in our home. And so I tried to force things. I'm like, well, this is what should happen. This is how it should look. This is what our family should be. And realizing that that was driving a divide between me and my stepkids, between my husband and I, between me and his ex-wife, and all of the things.
Help me understand what specifically you're talking about.
So like trying to enforce things that like looked so like when kids go to bed or manners or like basic things.
This is what we do in this family.
Yes. And realizing that, you know what, these kids already have enough that they're processing going back and forth between houses that maybe I don't need to push the manners right now, which is really hard as a mother to let go of, or hygiene things that aren't getting, and realizing that they have a parent that's going to do that. If their parent doesn't care, I can't care, which like still like makes me cringe.
I can't care in your voice.
I've gotten really good at it, but it's still hard to then set that, honestly, that boundary with myself of saying, hey, this isn't helping anybody. It's really not helping me. So how do I put that in place of catching myself, saying, okay, I'm not going to say these things at dinner. I'm going to have a good conversation. And it took a long time. A lot of just sitting there biting my tongue through dinners and different things.
You know, you can hide in some cases who you are to some people, not your family.
No.
Not in your home. Like it's all bets are off. Kids see everything. And so they see the best and the worst, but it's good that they see the struggle. And that's why I think your transparency is so great, because you're not saying, oh yeah, it's so easy. But there are so many families, millions of families dealing with this very thing right now and trying to figure out how to negotiate and how to renegotiate and what these boundaries are. You know, I was talking earlier to my sister about how, like, you know, boundaries, and it became very clear to me early in our conversation that we both had a different definition of what boundaries was. And I'm just curious as to how you came to know about boundaries. It seems like we throw that term around a lot and just assume everyone in society is on the same page. I really don't think that that's right. So what's your definition, and how did you come to say, hey, this is actually going to make my life work?
Yeah. So for me, boundaries are putting things in place that protect myself, my true self, my integrity, the things that bring me joy in life. And while it sounds like I'm just talking all about me, when I put those in place, I show up as my true self, which in turn allows the people around me to be able to show up as their true selves. It allows them to then say, well, okay, Jessica, you know, has done this thing and she's made it clear that she won't do this or that. I can do that too. And that is so powerful. I mean, that is where we get to find who we really are. And I have found that the more I do that, the more I am true to myself and honest with other people about that, which is a boundary. That's setting that boundary in place of, I'm really not comfortable with this. And sometimes that looks like me walking away from a situation because I just can't even have the words to say it. And that's okay too. And maybe revisiting it later, or maybe not at all. But when I do that, I've seen people blossom around me and feel safe. And perfect example is my ex-husband, who I knew for 5.5 years of our marriage, actually probably longer than that he was gay. But he was not ready to come out. He was not ready to leave this life that he thought he was supposed to live. And so the more he knew I was okay in being myself within this dynamic that we had, the more he was able to love himself. And that continued throughout our divorce, that the more I could give myself space to be who I was and to love and support myself, the more he felt entitled and worthy of that as well. And he was able to blossom into who he is today, a totally different man than the one I married, but also the core of who he is still there, and the things I love about him are still there, but very, a different side of him that he's been able to embrace and love. And so I think that for me is the beauty in this, that the power of boundaries and being true to yourself, it gives you that gift, but it then gives that gift to everybody that you meet, because they get to see you being your true, authentic self, standing up for yourself, and it gives them the power and courage and safety to be themselves as well.
Having and creating boundaries can create a lot of really uncomfortable feelings that I think a lot of us just naturally want to avoid. And so I want to have a conversation with Reva Cook as part of the Healing Group. She's a licensed clinical social worker and has experience in talking to people about these kinds of uncomfortable feelings that come up when establishing boundaries. So when you have an uncomfortable, conversation to have about establishing boundaries, I want to back it up first and just talk about the value of it. Like, what are the benefits of establishing boundaries? Like mental, physical, emotional, like why should we even care?
Good questions. The funny thing is we are all establishing boundaries all the time. We just may not be establishing ones that are really effective. And if we feel uncomfortable, that means we're uncomfortable with the boundary that we have established. It's not working. So I think it's kind of interesting when people are like, oh, it just feels so awkward to set boundaries. And I'm like, well, you're feeling awkward with the boundary you've actually already set. So boundaries are all about health. Boundaries are about health for relationships with other people, with ourselves, with our time, with our money, with our physical possessions. It's all about using and being able to use those things in ways that allows us to get the most out of life and
I like that.
Have the best experience.
So how has this worked in your own life?
Well, I'm a human, so I have to set boundaries, right? Being able to set boundaries with our jobs and our kids and our partners, our friends, it enables all of us, me included, to be able to be hopefully a better version of myself. When I'm functioning in a place of good boundaries, I am taking responsibility for what I'm responsible for, and I'm not taking responsibility for things that I'm not responsible for.
Okay, so give me an example about how that might work. Because sometimes I feel like everything's my responsibility, and especially as my kids get older, and I'm trying to establish kind of boundaries with that. So how does it work?
Yeah. I'm curious, do you have an example from your kids? I think boundaries, the easiest way to learn them is to hear how other people are doing them or not doing them. So I can totally have an example, but I'm curious if you have one.
Yeah, I mean, let's both share an example, right? Like, because I think that's how we really learn, right? In real life. So I appreciate you being generous and being able to do that. For me, right now, what I'm experiencing is how do I reestablish or negotiate boundaries for my adult children who are still in school, who still need some financial assistance?
Love this. Okay. So I like to talk about the ABCs of boundaries. A is the awareness. We've got to be aware that there's something we need to establish, some sort of structure around, and the awareness comes from feelings of confusion or pressure or just feeling kind of, I hate to use this therapist-y word, but unsafe sort of in the situation. And so the B is behavior. What are you willing to do? Boundaries are about what we're willing to do. It is not about what we want someone else to do. That's a request. That's a real common confusion point we get with boundaries. People are like, well, I set a boundary with them. I told them, da, 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 da. And I'm like, that is not a boundary. That is a request. The boundary is what I will do if you don't meet my
and that's
request.
A lot more simple too, right? Because then that's something that I can control. Like I can help with this much money, or I can help with this, on this particular day for my time.
Exactly. Perfect. And so, with the kids and money and stuff, you would think about, what am I willing to do? What can I not do? What can I tolerate in this situation? And then the C is to clarify that, to let them know this is what it is. Many times when we set boundaries with people, the what we're going to do part is kind of implied, which sometimes is fine for informal sorts of boundary settings. If we're talking about bigger issues, particularly money, we really want to set that out. So the boundary might be, I have this much money to contribute to your tuition this semester. I'm happy to help you try to brainstorm what to do with the rest of it. I'm happy to listen to your feelings about it. But after I've given that money, I don't have any more to give you. Your kid may have all of their own feelings about this.
Well, they do. That's the thing. And each kid has their own feelings.
Yes.
So you think you get it right with one, or you know, you can anticipate it. And then it's going to be an entirely different conversation, obviously, because it's a different person.
Here's the thing. The success of a boundary isn't if the other person is happy with it.
Oh, okay. How do you measure success then?
So success is you figuring out what you feel comfortable with and letting them know, and then you sticking to what you'll do. The other person is allowed to have their own feelings about that, and that's their responsibility. We can have empathy, we can be kind and compassionate. Sometimes people think setting boundaries is about saying no or being mean. And I'm like, you can set a firm, clear boundary in the kindest way with the most empathy for how someone feels about that. And they may give you feedback and be like, well, I think that is not a great boundary. And I think you should do this or that. And you can say, I will take that under consideration. And then you can decide, do I want to shift my boundary? Do I not want to shift my boundary? Boundaries can be very, very flexible. So an example, this is one that we've been dealing with at our house.
Okay.
I have young adult children as well. And they are coming and going all the time.
Yeah. Okay.
And one of the boundaries that we have set is you are welcome to live at home as long as you are actively engaged, and we will room board covered, as long as you are actively engaged in forward movement in your life. You're in college, or you're, doing something that's moving you towards bigger goals in life.
Okay.
And you contribute to the household by cooking one meal a week and helping with yard work so many hours a week and helping with chores. Specific chore once a week.
Great.
That's what we're willing to do. And then we're asking you to do these other things. But here's the boundary part. Okay. If you can't do those things, you can choose to leave and go live on your own again and do it however the heck you want. Or we're going to charge you for us doing your cleaning or doing your chores.
Okay.
And we have had to hold that boundary.
So how does that
were so mad. They did not like it.
Do you just give them a bill, or you just text them like, you owe me this much because you didn't do any chores this week?
We did Venmo requests.
Did you? Did they do it? Because again, that's a request.
It is. They responded. They were mad. They didn't like it. They didn't think it was fair. But we had a good enough relationship that they did honor that request. If they hadn't honored the Venmo request, we would have had to set another boundary with them. Like, you have 2 days to respond to that Venmo request, and then we're doing whatever. There's a saying in therapy that a boundary protested is often a sign that boundary was really needed.
Oh, okay. So if you do get that kind of tension and pushback, then you probably hit the right place.
Yeah, it means there's something there to work on. They are not being good with their boundaries. Boundaries exist on a continuum. So when I said we're all setting them, we all are. And it's ranging from really porous boundaries, which are very loosey-goosey. I want you to be responsible for my stuff. I don't want to be responsible for my stuff, all the way to really rigid, which is I am not willing to be flexible. I am not willing to consider other people. So it exists all the way along there. And in a healthy place, we ask for what we need and other people respond, and we work together to kind of help all of us feel healthy and safe and be able to live our lives the best way that we can.
Well, and that's such a great vision, right? Like, this is what we want in our families and in our relationships. Healthy, happy, clear, understood, so that we can have really deep, meaningful connections. But sometimes in that moment, we're like, at least for me too, I don't want to be mean. And it feels mean when I have to like hold fast on a boundary, whether it's about, a rule in the house or what I will and will not discuss or I don't know, sometimes, and especially in families, I think it can get tricky if we're going on beyond kids, like a parent-kid relationship, but we're talking about like with your spouse or with your in-laws or with your parents or with your, sister-in-laws. You have these kinds of different boundaries depending on the relationship and how close you are with that person. And they can create some of these feelings of being uncomfortable. So while we might really like agree with all the principles and go, yes, I'm going to do it, I'm establishing a new boundary because I feel uncomfortable in this thing. So I know I need to. And then we go to do it. And then we are afraid that we're going to come across as mean or demanding and be sort of kicked out of that relationship or ignored. And so how do we push through those kinds of fears or even talk about it before we establish those boundaries?
I think being aware of ourselves and having a good sense of our own identity, what's important to me and what's not important to me, will make it easier. Also, understanding how to regulate our own emotions. Can I take some deep breaths?
Yeah.
Can I remind myself this is going to be okay? Can I remind myself if they have a fit, then that's a sign to me that either I'm being too rigid or porous and I need to shift, or is it a sign that they are being too rigid or porous? And this is a bigger relationship issue, and I'm not going to solve it with this one particular boundary setting experience, but I'm going to have to keep working at it. I find it really helpful to remind myself that I am not responsible for how they feel about my boundary. And sometimes we can remind people of that in kind ways. I think we can set boundaries with soft, kind voices, honoring someone else's feelings about that. I know this might be hard for you to hear. I wish I could fix this for you. I wish it was possible for this to be different, but this is how it needs to be. And I think we can set boundaries with that, and even acknowledging this sounds really hard for you. You don't like this.
Yeah. And kind of being with them through that. That's an interesting perspective. I have seen, unfortunately, so many different relationships where people just walk away from the relationship, right? And just say, I'm not even going to talk to this person or deal with it, whether it's a ghosting situation or a boundary that says, I'm not going to see you or talk to you for a long time. And that always seems to me to be so extreme and not what we want when we talk about having, good, strong, happy families.
Yeah.
So, what is it that we can keep in mind when either we feel the tendency to do that? And again, in extreme cases of, abuse or, horrible neglect and things like that, that may be a necessary,
right. Because
boundary.
It's about health. And if that's what you have to do to be healthy, there may be some people that shouldn't be a part of your life. But in most relationships, when it gets to that extreme point, what I have known is there's been a lack of small boundary setting along the way. And then people just hit a point where they're like, I don't know what to do about this. And I'm overwhelmed. Right. And I'm just done. And so by not taking responsibility for our own actions and our emotions, or by taking responsibility for someone else's, in small ways, we actually are postponing and increasing the amount of pain and discomfort. So it's like, am I going to have a teeny little bit of uncomfortability here? I'm going to take it all in. I'm going to just not say anything, and it's going to bubble over at some point.
I mean, wouldn't you agree in I don't know any family that I've ever, talked to that doesn't have some sort of, issue with this, right?
Oh,
Or, so-and-so's not talking to so-and-so anymore. If she shows up at the party, then he's not coming, and, whatever it is in a family. And so your call to say, hey, establish those smaller boundaries ahead of time, I think could save so much of this kind of family drama and fragmentation.
Yeah. And I think sometimes we think we can only deal with an issue when it's right in the moment. And that might be the worst time to try to deal with it. Yeah. We can go back. We can revisit issues with people and be like, hey, do you remember when you asked me to do this and this? And I just said yes. And after further reflection, I have realized that going forward, I won't be able to come to Sunday family dinner every single week or whatever it is. We can revisit those issues and try and set them up for the future. I think one of the things that makes us really uncomfortable is we want people to agree with our boundaries.
Yeah.
And of course we do. It feels so nice when people agree with us. Yeah. It makes us feel validated. And I think we've got to take that responsibility for, I would like everyone to agree with my boundary. And be like, well, but that's not going to happen because we have different priorities in life. And it is okay if they're not upset, if they're upset about it. They can give me feedback. I can adjust it. I can shift it if need be. But if this is really what I need to have a healthy space for myself, then I'm going to have to be okay with them not being okay.
I'm joined by my good friend and conflict mediator, Emily Taylor, who has really talked and guided a lot of people through negotiating boundaries when conflict inevitably arises. You're the expert on this, and we've had a lot of chats as friends about this very thing. So I want to ask you about what your experience with boundaries is with your family.
Wow. Lots of experience. So as you know, I have a lot of kids, but also I think sometimes it's tricky. We just define our family as like parents and kids, but there's a lot more to it, right? You have in-law relationships, you're an aunt and uncle. Anyway, there's a lot of different roles that we can play. But in terms of boundaries, just a quick definition, my part, is basically it's like a psychological limit or an expectation for how you want to participate in a relationship. So that could be a family boundary. It could be an individual boundary. It could be like within a couple, like we talk about this stuff in public, this stuff we talk about in private, right? So it's a negotiated space about how you are going to behave and then how you're hoping the other person is going to behave towards you.
So there is some hope involved in there. Like, yes. I hope your behavior is aligned with this, but if it's not, here's where I stand.
Yeah, and there's negotiation. So say, for example, family boundary. Even yesterday, I found myself doing the dishes again. And I had set kind of as a family, we had discussed, who's going to do the dishes and when. It's a super boring topic for me personally. Like, I don't really want to think about who's going to do the dishes.
Yeah, we got other things to talk about.
Yes, but when I end up being the person that does the dishes because I care more probably than anyone else in the family that the dishes are put away, then it becomes an issue of negotiated space. Hey, we're all living together. This is something that's important to me. I'm hoping over time it's important to you too. Like yesterday, I actually kind of bent my boundary. My boundary is I'll usually harp a little bit and be like, hey, it's time for you to do dishes. Please do your dishes. But what's healthy is allowing sometimes to be flexible. I gauged the family feeling last night and was like, you know what? I have the energy to do this. I don't really want to push on this person right now. They seem like it would cause too much stress in the relationship. So I did the dishes. But if I do that every day and I take a kind of like I oblige every time, I'm going to blow. I know I will. So I like to call that obliger fatigue. So if I don't consistently back up my boundary, other people are probably going to know that they can push on it. And then I'll end up doing the work and maybe resenting that person or maybe getting crazy and push back really hard when they don't do what I want them to do.
Well, nobody knows you better and more intimately than your family members, right? So
Exactly.
they know how to push your buttons. They know how far they can push it or not.
Yes.
And so that's an interesting question about how you like maintain. I know that the internal dialogue that I would have would be in that moment, how do I maintain this boundary and say I'm serious about it? But also they're super stressed out and I don't want to add to their burden. But if I do it, I'm sending a message. But if I don't do it, I'm also sending a message.
Exactly. So I think that's where, again, even just like setting a boundary to begin with, I think some people set them really fast, like in a relationship. They'll be like, you know what? I just don't text. If I don't like respond to you, great. But I think most people who have struggle with boundaries, we don't set them early enough and we're not consistent and then we're not willing to kind of flexibly change them as the relationship changes. We may kind of keep it a little bit weak as we go along. We're like, oh, well, I'll kind of test this out. And then when it becomes a problem, then we try to set a boundary. But there's so much time has passed that we don't feel comfortable setting a boundary. Like it feels awkward. They're like, why didn't you tell me in the beginning that you were going to be mad about this?
Yeah, months ago.
Yes.
But if you were trying to kind of figure out the relationship or figure out what you really, now I know what I care about. So give me an example about how that could work in practice.
Okay, so this may sound silly, but when my husband and I were dating, he had just come from a bad breakup. I had just come from a good breakup.
Okay, good.
So it was a little funny because he was like concerned about certain things in the relationship. Like he brought up, like even talking about money. Like it sounds silly, but even like in a dating relationship, once you get serious, it actually becomes more like, sometimes I might pay as a woman, sometimes he might pay as the guy, right? Instead of it just being like, hey, I invited you out. So it sounds weird, but as a boundary, he was like, just like he talked about it openly as we were dating further along. And then it was like, oh, like it would be normal now that we're like officially dating that sometimes I would help out. I have talked to I have a friend who actually that was an issue in their dating relationship. They both have, they're divorced, they have kids. And then he told her, well, I think you should pay for something sometime. And she was like, what? Like, I'm a single mother with 5 kids and like, why should I be paying for this date? But he saw it as a symbol of like, hey, you have to show that you're interested in this relationship. So what did that bring about? That was like a big conversation for them. Like, why are you asking me for this symbolic behavior that actually totally stresses me out? So yes, feel the relationship out, but also when those things come up, those may be kind of signals like, whoa, like that doesn't work for me.
So how did they resolve that? I have to know.
I feel bad. They ultimately are not together.
Oh, they broke up?
Yeah, they broke up. But it was years. It was years of like, but for her, it was like so offensive that he would put her in a position to show her generosity of spirit by paying for something when she was really struggling financially. But for him, it was a sign that she was invested in the relationship. So
you can see it from both sides.
You can.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so yes, get to know someone. But if something becomes an issue, it's much easier to bring it up gently before it's really annoying or offensive or just like really downright rude. Mm-hmm. But bringing it up in a way and saying, you know what, I've noticed that when we, go out, there's kind of this hesitation before the bill comes. What's that about? Like I'm used to when I date men that they would pay for me instead of it being like a big fight on Sunday night after the weekend's happened and he paid grudgingly and then you have to have this big conversation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Is this something that you have navigated well, or maybe had some bumps in the road with your own family?
For sure. I think that I tend to be a people pleaser. So I want to be able to do everything that you expect of me. But as I've gotten older, and maybe this is the middle-aged woman coming out of me, I'm like, I'm tired of doing this.
Yeah.
So I
think tired is a big theme for moms.
Yeah, there's the tired. But sometimes you just get tired of sacrificing as a kind gesture, and people don't reciprocate. They actually just expect you to keep giving. And if that, it's not sustainable. So boundaries allow us to continue a relationship in a healthy way. Like, instead of just someone like, it's like a Death Eater, like coming to suck you and be like, oh, I can tell she's a pleaser. I had a boss. So, for example, I had a boss in a Midwestern big town at a nonprofit, and it was obvious she was used to getting her way with just about everything. I was new, testing the waters like we were talking about. I kind of went along with it. And then I would hear her and I talked about this in my book, actually. I think I changed it to someone else besides myself. But now that we're on radio, I'll just say it.
The real story.
It was me. Anyway, but she started bad-mouthing there were two of us in the same work position, and she would just criticize her. And I kind of said something to stick up for this person. So a boundary was, hey, if I'm on a work team, we don't talk like this. But she was my boss, so I was a lot more gentle. And then I made this slight mistake. Honestly, it was a very small mistake. And so then she started criticizing me. And she pushed on a boundary of how, like, I started to really struggle. I felt insecure. I mean, driving into work every day, and I felt totally stressed. And after counseling with some good friends and my new husband at the time, I decided that it wasn't worth my mental health to continue working for her.
Wow.
I had the option to quit because financially we were in a situation where I could do that. But once I went in and just said, you know what? So-and-so, Jan, whatever your name is, I'm not comfortable with this. I'm going to be leaving. And then, interestingly, you can find the surprise in my book of what happened to her. But there was a firm boundary of, if I'm not even going to be able to even function, this isn't sustainable. So if I could think about those things earlier in the path, now when I go to get a job, I'm pretty honest about what expectations I have. So with my former boss that I just had here at BYU, I actually told him, I said, I do really well with just sincere praise, and I like a lot of independence, and I will work really hard for you. And it was interesting to watch him follow up with exactly what I had asked him for, and he would just give me honest, sincere praise, and that's all I needed. And I functioned in a great way, but I asked for it. So a boundary I had was, I need some freedom, but I also need some words of affirmation. That's my love language, main one. And it worked brilliantly. But I asked for it up front because I had experience with the opposite.
How do you teach that to your kids, to make clear boundaries?
I think through direct experience. I'll talk to, say, I have lots of teenagers in my house right now. And my expectation is that they're not on, say, I'm not a fan of pornography. That's not something I really enjoy that they would be watching. So we have an expectation of when you're on the computer, we set structural things, but we also talk about it and revisit the issue, and kind of like, not under my roof. I'm not authoritarian because that doesn't work, but we talk through it and we come up with something that works for both parties. And I think that through parenting, like everything the research says, if you have high structure, high warmth, and respect for your child's autonomy, those kids tend to do the best.
With boundaries and with
for sure.
Emotional.
Yes. We get scared as parents, so we will start trying to control everything, but it actually backfires. If you try to control and withdraw your love when your kids don't do what you want them to do, that kind of being a personal boundary, it actually can create the exact opposite of what you want. So resist.
Yeah. Resist the urge just to control.
Yes.
Even if we know better
Yes.
and love them the most.
Yes.
And we're right.
Ask for forgiveness.
Right.
Sorry, I crossed your boundary. You're a person. You can make decisions.
What do you do in a situation, because this inevitably happens, where you've set clear boundaries, people know what your boundaries are, but there's that one person who's like, yeah, but I'm the exception because I'm your spouse, mom, sister, I mean, whatever, best friend, whatever it is. And what do you do in that situation?
I think first, self-reflect. The relationships are dynamic. They're going to change over time. So one boundary that you had in the past, it may be the same. It may need to be revised. So always considering that a boundary, while you set it, maybe it's not functioning like you wanted it to. Boundaries, especially in close relationships, are set so that you have enough to sustain yourself, that you can love the other person, that you can experience intimacy, right? That's why, at least for me, that's why I set a boundary.
It's a great motivator.
So if it's not working and it is an intimate relationship, you probably need to have the conversation. But sometimes I need a little space, and I have my little tribe of a few people that I talk to and say, hey, is this, am I off here? It's easy. And then what I always counsel people to do, and again, as a mediator, is consider what your main needs are. So if I'm setting a boundary, I consider what my needs are in that very intimate relationship you're implying. And then I try to brainstorm. So instead of saying getting counsel and my friend says, oh, you should just blah, blah, blah. You should just tell your husband, don't do that or whatever.
Yeah. Thanks, Janet. Super helpful.
Which is fine. But usually we do much better if we take the time to reflect and be like, you know what? I really just need some private alone time to go to a class or take a walk and not have anyone asking me for stuff. So if that's my need, there's a lot of different ways you can figure that out. So brainstorm, I would say, a little bit by yourself or with a trusted other person, and then you can go into a conversation and be prepared to actually talk through it and find out what their need is, because you actually may have the same need, but you may have different ideas about how to solve it.
Oh, sure.
So be consistent, but also expect that your relationship is changing. It's always changing. So maybe a little revision is not bad, but don't just ignore it because you might blow someday, especially if you're like me.
Or you just keep it, I'm fine. I'm not fine. Right?
Or you start grumbling to other people and you're like, I don't want to be this person that's always complaining. So,
well, you bring up a really good point, because I can tell when I am the grumpiest, why do I hate everybody and everything? I think to myself, okay, so maybe I need to establish some boundaries because everyone else is fine. Everyone else is just it's just a regular Wednesday or whatever. And if I am feeling that way, then that means I feel overworked or underappreciated or taken advantage of or just too busy. And I think, okay, so this is not how I want to live my life. I'm in control of that. I got to set some more boundaries. But I don't know why I have to learn it so dramatically.
Well, I don't think you're the only one. But I think that feeling of everybody else is fine, but I feel used. When you feel used, it's usually a sign that you're not sustaining or you don't have good enough boundaries.
Okay, so you're caught in this moment where you're just oh, it happened again.
Yes.
And you feel that. What's the best way to get out of it?
I would say sometimes we lash out, but that's not actually going to produce anything. We actually want to go into we are super creative beings. I just have this immense hope that people can find ways that will make their lives better.
Yeah.
But you have to take the time. You have and that could be mentally thinking through things, emotionally, getting it out, with a trusted person. Actually breathe, take a hike, physically get out some energy, and then put yourself in a position to make good decisions. So sometimes we try to set a boundary, and parents do this all the time, especially if young children misbehave in public. They feel like they have to draw this public stance, you must go back to the car and we're never coming to,
Look at what a good parent I am.
Yeah, you're not going to Disneyland ever again because, you were crying in the line. Whatever it is, say, you know what? This looks like we need to talk through this, or I notice that I'm feeling a little out of control. I need to do some me search. So my good friend Andy, he talked about, like, even I was having some like health issues, and he's just said, maybe you should do some me search. Just take some time.
I like this.
Yeah. Figure out what's going on with you. Don't make any rash decisions. Just see what would benefit your life and slow down a little bit. Oftentimes we try to go faster through conflict when we actually need to go a little slower and observe. Do a little me search. Do a little search about the people around you too.
And I guess that looks like what? Meditation, hiking, whatever. For me, I think taking a nap or just, I mean,
it could be.
I'm like, are you hungry? Are you tired?
Yeah.
Lisa? Like,
yeah, I think of
actually your basic needs. Like, what is it? What do you need?
I think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like, if you're not sleeping, if you're not eating, and interestingly, little plug for a great new book called Breath, like if you are not like breathing deeply and like actually getting the oxygen you know, whatever you need, you're going to be off a little bit. So just take time to figure out what it is.
The Lisa Show is a production of BYU Radio. This week, our show was produced by Lisa Valentine Clark, Richie T. Stedman, and McKay Menden, with help from Tabby Freitas, with music and sound design by Katie Johnson and Sam Clausen. We would love to hear your feedback about the show. You can reach out to us on Instagram or Facebook, or email us at thelisashow@byu.edu. Next week on the show, a special conversation with actor and comedian, my friend Kirby Hayborn.
We don't want him to show up and the thunderclouds come up. But there's a part of me that was on the inside, like, remember all those times you were on top of me, beating the crap out of me, and you made the dog come over and lick my eyeball? Well, guess what? Your mother-in-law is coming.
That's next week on The Lisa Show.